Welcome. My name is Stacia Stribling. I am the Deputy Director of Formed Families Forward, and I'm joined today with Renee Myers, our Educational Specialist. And we're going to go ahead and get started and start out with some information about us for those of you who might not know us. Go ahead, Renee.
So Form Families Forward is a family-led resource center. We serve foster, adoptive, and kinship families, mostly who are raising children and youth with special needs, as well as the professionals in our community who serve them. We have a lot of free trainings like the one you're at here tonight. We offer consultations to families. We have events. We have a summer picnic. We have a big spring event for families. We have a great resource directory that if you have not checked out, that's on our website and has lots of great resources that you can filter through different topics and different types of resources you're looking for. We have peer support groups, not only for youth, but for adults as well. We have videos and resources and webinars on our website, lots and lots of resources for you to check out. And we are a family partner to the Virginia Tiered Systems of Support.
There will be, if you need a certificate of attendance, after this, Renee is going to drop into the chat the email address for our administrative specialist, Natalie, and that is who you can reach out to after tonight. And those certificates of attendance are only good for people who are attending live. So if you are watching this recording, we are glad that you are here and getting the information, but unfortunately we cannot do certificates for people who watched the recordings.
So here are some of our great upcoming offerings. On October 2nd, we have a webinar on communicating effectively, the hard and the easy. On November 13th, we have a webinar, Functional Behavior Assessments, What Families Should Know. And then on December 12th, we have another webinar, Making the Most of Your Child's IEP, the 411 on creating effective IEP goals.
Registration for those, the links for the registration will be dropped into the chat, or you can check us out at our website, formedfamiliesforward.org, and you can find those registration links there as well.
Here's another great resource we have. It's called Learning Your Way. It's an online opportunity to take courses. It's all self-paced. It's totally free. You just register and then you have access to all these different courses that we have. We have 7 different courses, special education, communication, trauma, dispute resolution, kinship care, other health impairments. And our newest addition is a parenting course, positive parenting course. So it's just one-time registration and that gets you access to all these courses. Again, it's free, it's self-paced learning. And at the end, you get a certificate of completion for each lesson that you do and to show the hours that you put towards that. And I will drop that in the chat as well, registration for that. As I said earlier, we have peer support groups. We have a kinship support group that meets virtually on the first Thursday, and they meet in person on the third Thursday evening of the month. And then we have a Form Families Together support group that's virtual on the first Sunday evening and in person on the third Wednesday evening. And this is our Stronger Together youth peer support groups. They meet in person. It's for youth and young adults aged 14 to 22. They meet on Tuesday nights from 6:30 to 8. It'll begin October 1st. We have a clinician there, and this is free of charge at our office in Fairfax City. And there's the registration, and I'll drop that in the link. I'll drop the link in the chat in just a moment.
All right. Thank you, Renee, for sharing that. Lots of information, lots of great things that you all can take advantage of. But we're going to dive into tonight's topic. Together is better. So how do we collaborate with schools? And so I'll introduce myself. As I said earlier, I'm Stacia Stribling, the Deputy Director of Formed Families Forward. Prior to being in this role, I was an educator myself. So I come from that area. I taught first and second grade for several years in Fauquier County. Then I went on to do some graduate work and became a teacher educator and taught at George Mason University for 23 years. So I was teaching teachers. So I'm pretty immersed in, have been pretty immersed in the education system. So I bring that lens to this work. I am also a mom to these two cuties you see on the screen here, who my son and daughter were both adopted through foster care. So I bring the lens of a form of being from a formed family and advocating for my kiddos in the school system. Also, fun fact, I'm also a part-time farmer, so, which doesn't have anything to do with anything except that it keeps me quite busy. There is my email address. So afterwards, if you want to touch base, have any questions specifically for me, you're always welcome to reach out. Okay, so now that you know who I am, Renee is going to go ahead and launch a poll here so that we can get a sense of who you all are. And you can mark all that apply. Just to get a sense of who is in the room here. Do we have foster parents, adoptive parents, kinship caregivers, birth parents, human service professionals, or any teachers in this space? And so as soon as that poll gets launched, you can choose more than one. So you might fit in more than one category there. All right, numbers are coming in. Looks like we've got a foster parent, some adoptive parents, a birth parent, and we have two teachers as well. Awesome. So you guys can jump in and share your experiences as well. Oops, that's me. I guess I could, sorry, figuring out how this whole thing works. All right. So what we're going to cover today, this is sort of a broad overview. First, we're going to talk sort of about that teacher perspective. So what is it that teachers know about foster, adoptive, kinship families, or don't know in many cases, and what is their training like? What do they come to the table with? And then we're going to talk about how do we build collaborative relationships with them, and we're going to focus specifically on language and on the structures that we create. And we're going to wrap up with talking about what to share and when to share it, the importance of protecting our children's stories, and we have some resources for you that can kind of help teachers get to know your kids. So, teacher preparation requirements. Teachers are tasked with doing a lot. they get a lot on their plate, and so we do want to start out by giving them kudos for the tremendous job that they have ahead of them. When you look at what is required to be a teacher, that often can look different from state to state, but we went through and we looked at what are really the big broad requirements that everyone across the country needs to have. There's clearly coursework involved with that, and a lot of that coursework will focus on human development, although unless you're in a special education certification program, most of that development they talk about is more neurotypical. There's also coursework on curriculum and instruction. So this is what do we need to teach, and then how do we teach that, right? The art of teaching it. There's going to be classroom management courses. A lot of these are rooted in behaviorist approaches. How to keep the classroom running smoothly, how to get kids to do what you want them to do, how to motivate them, incentivize them to do the things that we're asking them to do in a classroom. There's some coursework on assessment, and then you do have some coursework, either some pieces either woven into those courses or some separate standalone courses that do focus on diversity. Sometimes though, that diversity is more about racial diversity or cultural diversity, and don't often hit on different ways that families might be formed, right? Doesn't always fall under that diversity heading. There's also some field experiences, and that can vary across the state and even sometimes within states, depending on the school. There are some teacher prep programs where teachers are placed in classrooms throughout all of their coursework so that they can kind of see and connect with what they're learning theoretically and what it looks like in practice. For some, they don't get into the classroom until they've completed all the coursework, and the first time they're in there is for student teaching. So there's not a whole lot of hours in front of a classroom before they're put in there. There is some type of assessment in order to get a teaching license. We use the Praxis here in Virginia, so an assessment that says, yes, I know enough about what I'm teaching, the content, and I know how to teach it. And there is child abuse and neglect training that is required for all teachers because they are mandated reporters. So this training focuses more on how do I recognize signs of abuse and neglect, and what is my job in terms of reporting that. And that's sort of the bulk of what they know about abuse and neglect. Which leads us to what's missing, right? And these are the pieces that are missing from most teacher preparation programs. Any information on trauma, although I have to say they are doing a lot more with that for in-service teachers. So in order to maintain their licensure, teachers do have to get continuous training. And so more of that has been focusing on trauma lately. FASD, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, both of my kiddos are diagnosed under this umbrella. And I did not know, as a teacher and as a teacher educator, I knew nothing about that until I was parenting them. So this is not stuff that is covered in your general ed coursework for teacher prep. What's missing is any information on foster care, adoption, and kinship care, different ways that families might be formed. And there's also a lot of not a lot covered on mental health and how we handle that. Again, we see some of that in service opportunities for teachers once they're in the classroom teaching, but prior to getting in the classroom, there is not a whole lot of that. And it does depend, right? It depends on who their professor is. So when I was teaching at Mason, you better believe that I touched on trauma and FASD, but that's because it was within my wheelhouse and that was my experience. And so you might see pockets of that in places, but the majority of teachers are not really going to be trained on any of these issues, which is huge for us, right? Because these are our kiddos in foster, adoptive, and kinship families. And just a little bit of background and throwing some research out there. Reasons for entering care are often associated with disability. So in one state, more than a quarter of children over age 5 with sustained maltreatment were identified as having disabilities. So we do have special ed teachers that have been trained in some of those disabilities, although it's questionable whether or not they've been trained on that trauma piece as well. About 37% of infants and toddlers in non-relative foster care had developmental delays. You've got developmental, cognitive, or academic needs are rather high in this population. And adopted children are more likely to have ever been diagnosed with things such as depression, ADHD, or behavior or conduct disorder. Is this sounding familiar to folks there? Right, we live this. So what does this mean? You have teachers that know a lot of things, but also there's a bunch of stuff that they don't know. And so what happens is when these kiddos come into their classrooms, it's they start to see behaviors, which are symptoms of things that children may have been through and may have experienced, but teachers don't always know how to frame it that way, right? Most times when we see behavior, I've got 26 kids in the classroom, this is willful, my job is to just stop this behavior, right? And there's not always this understanding of this idea of this window of stress tolerance, right? And so some of you may be familiar with that from other trainings and trainings on trauma, but we know down in the bottom part, this gray area is sort of when we're regulated, right? We're calm, we can manage our emotions and impulses, we can kind of handle the things that life throws at us. We're functioning from our prefrontal cortex, or what we might call our upstairs brain, where we can problem solve, we can process things, make a plan, carefully execute it. Now, there are stressors that come into our life, and we have this window of stress tolerance. So in that sort of blue area is where we might be adding stress to it, but we can still remain pretty regulated. And it's important to point out that not all stress is bad, right? There is stress is sort of necessary, and it could be a real good motivator for us, right? If we've got a work deadline that might induce some stress, but we're able to work within that, right? What happens though when that stress gets to be a bit much and more than what our brain can tolerate is when we start hitting this dysregulated stage. And that's the top part, the white above the window. And what happens in this time during this time is that the stress or the sensory input has triggered an alarm, right? And we sort of say that our brains have flipped. And then we start functioning from what we call that downstairs brain, or in our family, we sometimes call it the dinosaur brain, right? The first part of our brain that is focused purely on survival. And when we get in that dysregulated state, it's very difficult to listen and comprehend. We're not in that learning space, and start to maybe display some of those maladaptive behaviors. Now, we know with kiddos in foster, adoptive, and kinship families, sometimes because of traumas that they've experienced, that window of stress tolerance is really small, right? We can't handle a lot of stress before we kind of hit that dysregulated state. I remember with my own son saying to the therapist, it's like he goes from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds flat, right? And I remember her explaining to me, well, Stacia, he's never really at 0. He hovers at about 60 all the time, right? And so they're always kind of in that heightened state. And these are things that are important for teachers to understand, so that when they're faced with some of those behavioral symptoms from these kiddos in the classroom, they understand how to react to that. So our job is to build sort of those collaborative relationships with them to help them kind of understand our kiddos, where they come from, and give them some of that background. So we're going to launch another quick poll. And this one, just choose one answer for, but how would you describe your relationship with your child or your children's school? Would you consider it contentious, where there's constant conflict? Is it kind of minimal? So like no news is okay. We don't hear anything. We're doing all right. Is it more collaborative, where it's respectful and supportive, or does it really depend on the day? Okay, we've got a collaborative in there. And a contentious. Okay, it looks a little bit split here between really good or really not so good. We've got some collaborative experiences, and then some contentious, and some depends on the day. Yeah. Yeah. Or depends on the year, right? Which teacher we have. Sometimes some years are better than others. All right. Oops. I'm going to go ahead and close that. So we want to move to that collaborative stage. And so there's some things that we can do that can set the stage for that collaboration. These are some important points that might help. The first would be meeting in person. We do a lot online. We do a lot of emails. We do a lot of texting. Schools sometimes have apps that they use to communicate, and all of those things are great. But in starting that relationship, and as early in the year as you can, meeting in person really helps to lay that groundwork for the reciprocal relationship. It's really hard sometimes to read tone or intention in an email or in a text message. Things can be misinterpreted because you don't have the benefit of that body language. You don't have the benefit of the back and forth. So having that in-person meeting can be really critical, and being very intentional about the expertise that you each bring to the table, right? We're experts on our children. Teachers are experts on content and pedagogy, and respecting that and having them have that respect for the expertise that we bring. Being proactive, sharing your child's challenges with teachers before they happen. And this can be tricky, and I struggle with this space sometimes in other areas, in other like after school activities or clubs, sports, things that my children are involved in, because we worry that if I give you this information up front, are you going to treat my child differently? Are you going to look at him differently? Are you going to be like, oh, that's the kid who, and that can be a real fear. But I think if we're really proactive about, look, my kid is amazing. These are the things they're really good at, but I know that there's going to be these challenges. Then the teacher doesn't get blindsided, right? And is prepared for some of those things a little bit better. It also feels if we don't share information first and then we share it after something big happens, I never want to feel like I'm just trying to make excuses for my kid at this point. So it's a little bit better to be proactive about some of those things and to share what works and what doesn't work and why. The why is important, right? I'm not telling you don't do a sticker chart with my kid because I'm pushy parent. I'm telling you don't do a sticker chart with my kid because experience and research shows that it doesn't work for my child because they don't have the executive functioning skills for that particular tool to be effective for them, right? And so kind of backing that up with, we have tried this before and here's what we found. And then finally, creating a culture of problem solving, right? That we want to have a partnership where we can sit down together and say, yeah, these are the challenges and let's solve this together. And so we want to do that by considering the language we use as well as the structures that we create. So we're going to get a little bit more into that next. Language. Hearing about how our children are doing in school or responding to how they're doing in school can be really emotional for us, right? These kids are amazing and we love them and there's great things about them. But I think for me personally, what is frustrating is that not everybody sees that because that behavior sometimes they're not as comfortable in other places as they are in my home. So, and they're not getting their best self. And so we tend to be defensive sometimes when we hear what has been going on in school. So this is just some language that can be a little bit helpful when we hear things that can kind of ground us back into that place of problem solving. So when the teacher describes something that happened that day, responding with yes, oh, that behavior can be so frustrating, right? Connecting. We talk about this with our kids, right? Connecting before correcting. We want to make sure that they feel heard, that we know that their emotions are valid. Teachers need the same thing, right? It doesn't matter how old we are. We all need that sort of connection. So acknowledging, yeah, that is frustrating. I understand. When that happens at home, like you're not alone. I've experienced that as well. But here's what we have found, right? Or it sounds like we share a similar goal here. So that you're putting yourself back in that space with them in that problem solving space. All right, so now it's time for a little activity, and we're a small group, so you're welcome to unmute and just jump in here. But I've got a couple of comments that may or may not have happened in real life that I may or may not have heard in real life. And we're going to talk about, and I want you guys to think about what would be a really great way to respond to a teacher who might say this to you about your child. What's a great way to kind of begin and engage in that collaborative conversation? So here is the first one. One-on-one, Kieran is great, but he triggers all the other kids. So a teacher has just said this to you. Thinking about what we've said, how much you respond to that. And you could either unmute or throw it in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable doing.
Hi, I'd like to try.
Sure, go ahead, Julie.
What happened before the triggering?
Yes. Great. Because we have to be detectives with our kiddos, right? So asking those questions like, yeah, what was happening before to get more information? That's great. Any other ideas? You might want to say, kind of in agreement, yeah, like one-on-one, he's great. We do notice that when he's with his siblings, it can be a little bit harder, right? Yeah, that is a challenge for him. Let's talk about how we might address that challenge, right? Sort of connecting. Oh, we've got something in the chat here too. Oh, yes, needing more information from the teacher. Emily put in that happens at home sometimes as well. We've been working on taking a deep breath when he's with others. Great. So giving some strategies already that work. Yep. Awesome. All right.
May I
Here's
try
one more.
another one?
Please, Julie, go ahead.
Okay. In order to direct people toward facts instead of evaluations, what I like to say is, what did you see? What did you hear?
Great. Great. Yes. I am a trained qualitative researcher, and we talk about this in field notes, right? You've got your descriptive notes and your analytic. We often jump to that analytic and we make judgments and we kind of interpret things, but we need that descriptive piece in order to decide, are there other ways that we might be able to interpret that? Yeah, great. All right, let's try one more. Natalie's FBA says the function of her acting out is to escape work. Is everybody here familiar with FBA? That's a functional behavioral analysis. So they sort of look at what is the antecedent, what led up to the behavior, what is the function of the behavior, so that you can develop a behavior plan. So Natalie's FBA says the function of her acting out is to escape work. You really need to tell her how important school is and why she needs to try harder. This one hits my gut a little bit more. So how might you respond to that?
I'd like to try this one.
Yes, please.
Have you asked Natalie what her experience is when she engages in this behavior?
Great. Yeah, because that's a lot of adults interpreting that behavior, right? And not necessarily sometimes asking the child. It's amazing what they're able to tell you. Any other ideas? And again, you could drop it in the chat or you can unmute either way. I might also, this is where I might also take some opportunity for kind of educating too. With trauma, acting out, like behavior is a form of communication too. And it could be a brain that's overwhelmed. I wonder if she might be overwhelmed, right? It's not always black and white. Trying harder is not always the answer. Exactly. I don't know if any of you have ever read any work by Frost Green. He wrote The Explosive Child, and he also has a great book about schools called Lost at School, which is all about Plan B, and it's all about talking to the child. And he has this great saying. He's like, kids do well if they can. So if they're not doing well, it's not that they won't do well, it's that they can't do well, that something is going on, right? She's, and Angela shared here, she's acting out for a reason, right? And I wonder what other reasons, I wonder what other kind of interpretations we can have for her acting out. And this can go back to what Julie said with the other one, doing a little bit more digging. I wonder what's happening when she starts acting out. Can you give me an example of when the acting out happens? Tell me what's gone on there, right? Because certainly we do think school is important. And it isn't always about trying harder. That's right.
May I try again?
Yes, please, Julie, go ahead.
Like if you happen to know a little more about this behavior, you could say something like, does she most often try to escape work immediately after someone has been unfair to her?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's great. So, looking at maybe a little bit more specifically about what those triggers are, because that could be something completely different. Yeah. Great. All right. Thank you guys for sharing there. So language, starting to engage in that collaborative relationship is really important. And then there's also structures that we can put in place that can help build that collaboration. A communication journal is a great idea. Putting together a book that goes back and forth, where the teacher can share some things, you can share some things about home. And it's also important that we share the good things too in that, right? Not just the bad. Preschool was a rough time for us because every time I showed up, we had that communication page, but all it was a list of endless transgressions that my child had engaged in that day. So we also have to make sure that we're focusing on those positive things too. Also, having a way to give each other, the teacher and the caregiver, heads up when there are some potential challenges that we know might be challenges, right? So asking the teacher to communicate, can you let me know when there will be a substitute, because change is really hard for my kiddo. And so I need to prepare them, or when there's a change in schedule, right? When something is not following that typical day, and the typical timeline of the day, I need to prepare my kids. So let me know. Also, as caregivers, to let them know, you know what, Mother's Day is really tricky for my kiddo. And so I just want to give you a heads up that May tends to be a hard month for us because of all of those reminders. Or February, end of January, beginning of February is a really rough time, because that is when my child was removed from their first home, right? So letting them know that might be a tricky time. Setting up weekly or monthly check-ins, and those can be like a quick phone call, those can be a Zoom meeting, that can be just an email check-in, and creating problem-solving sessions, right? So I loved this about my son's school, but one of his later schools, it took us a long time to get to this point, but when there was a challenge going on, it was a difficult time of year, and what was being asked of him was really tricky. And so they said, hey, can we chat so we can kind of figure out how to deal with this? Let's problem solve how this is. So calling them problem solving sessions rather than, conferences or meetings that might have different connotations, that really is that collaborative piece. Resource sharing on both sides, right? So sometimes if I read something, if I've seen a really great resource about trauma, or I watched a really great webinar, I might shoot the link to them and say, hey, this relates to what we were talking about. This might be helpful for you. So that we know we're on that same page and we're there supporting each other. Doing some goal monitoring, and also some check-in, check-out. And Renee is going to drop in the chat. There's a good link that a couple of links that describe that check-in, check-out process. If done correctly, if done well, it can be really effective. Sometimes people have not been trained as well in the check-in, check-out. One of my experiences was that in the checkout phase, all they did was rehash all the things that had gone wrong that day with my son, and that's not really the purpose of it. So, so make sure you check out those resources for some more information, and make sure that that check-in, check-out process is something that is affirming for the child and helpful. Also, part of those structures are creating routines. Our kiddos thrive in routines, although they do sometimes try to resist them. But that predictable structure really eliminates those unknowns and can reduce stress for them. It also eliminates that opportunity for negotiation, right? Like, nope, this is our routine. This is what we do. We're not negotiating this. And so having those across both home and school can be really powerful, and sharing some of those things that work for you with the teacher to see how much of that can be mirrored, can be helpful. And the routine should include not just academic things, but social, emotional, relational components. Routines can be fun things too, right? You know, every Friday is movie night at home, right? And knowing that that's coming up, and knowing no matter how challenging that time was, we are going to have that space to build relationship and to connect. And there's ways that schools can and teachers can create some of those relational routines as well. And whenever possible, matching those home and school expectations. I'm going to share with you this matrix, PBIS. Renee is going to drop another link in the chat about some of this information. But you can see that this one has some expectations, right? And schools use these often, right? Be respectful, be responsible, be safe. Those can be really abstract concepts. And so at school, they might map out what does that look like. And you can do that at home too, right? What does being respectful look like at mealtime? What does it look like at work time, playtime, bedtime? And then similar matrices can be used at school as well. So what does being respectful look like during literacy centers? What does it look like during specials? What does it look like at lunchtime, right? So that these structures are similar. And so the child gets really used to what that looks like. So it doesn't seem like there's some random rules in this place and in that place. Everything is spelled out. And that routine and structure really helps take away some of that stress for our kids. All right, managing anxiety is one thing that those routines help with. And as we know, behavior is the language of trauma, right? Children are going to show you that they're in distress before they are able to tell you that they are in distress. So as we were talking about earlier, being those detectives, really digging into those behaviors to see what they mean. And in order to manage that anxiety, our strategies are really going to be rooted in co-regulation, in modeling, and in connecting. These work much better for our kids versus punishments, timeouts, consequences, right? These are the pieces that build relationship and help mitigate those trauma responses that they have. One thing that I learned from a therapist that my son worked with for a while, and I share this with the teachers as well. So finding those things that work for us and sharing them with teachers is these I wonder statements. A lot of times, especially when traumatic experience, we're sort of in that pre-verbal stage, they really have a hard time identifying those feelings or what's actually going on with them, right? That behavior is what leads things. They're in the downstairs brain. We're not really thinking and processing and able to articulate what is going on. And so it was suggested that we offer those words sometimes for our kids, right? And by using I wonder statements. Now, I was a little skeptical of this at first, right? Because it sounds kind of like leading the witness, right? If I say, oh, I wonder if you really miss birth mom right now, and that's what's happening, then I've planted that in his head, right? Well, I can guarantee you from doing this for years, that's not really what happens. My kid is very capable of saying, no, that's not it at all. But what it does is this draws them a little bit more back into their upstairs brain through that conversation and through giving them some thoughts and ideas that help pull them back up into their prefrontal cortex to be able to articulate. So you're giving them words and they're able to infer that this is what's going on, or deny, no, that's not it at all. So using some of these things in school might be like, if the child in particular, when they return from PE class, this is really the hardest part of our day. I wonder if you really like PE and you feel sad when this class ends. Giving them that language to be able to say, yeah, that is what's happening. And then from there, being able to problem solve, right? I wonder if it's hard for you to leave home and start your day. This is a big one. Because social interactions can be tricky for our kiddos. I wonder if you really want to play with so-and-so and need help to let them know that, because we're not sure how to insert ourselves in that situation. So this is a great strategy that you can share with teachers as well. This other one I came across at a conference once. Whoops, did not mean to do that, are called ampersand cards. So often, I am guilty of this. When a child is feeling an emotion, we're like, yeah, I see that you're angry, but this is what I need you to do. I know that you're angry, but we have to get out the door. And we always kind of follow the acknowledgement of that feeling with the word but. And so this kind of switches it and acknowledges that feeling and then follows it with an and statement, because all of those feelings are valid, right? You can feel angry. And when you are feeling angry, these are the things that you can do. So you can sit with your child and think about what are some of our difficult points, and sit down with them when they're in a calm state to make these cards. And this is a great thing that teachers can do at school as well, for some of those problem areas. And then come up with what are those ands? What are those things that you can do when you're feeling in that moment? So I feel angry and I can anchor my feet. I can picture a stream. I can practice square breathing. And then put this on a little ring card so that the child can flip to this, or you can flip to it for them if they're not in the space to do that themselves, to kind of help them to handle and deal with those emotions. This is another one, because it's not just about emotions. It's about like just sort of things that are hard, right? I don't know how to start my homework. And these are the things that I can do. I can ask for help. And this is some of the language I can use. Can you explain that part again? Can I show you what I know? Can I talk it through with you first before I have to write it down? Right. So these are strategies and skills that we're teaching kids, and these can be used both at home and at school. Okay. And then, we're doing pretty well on time. So I'm going to go through this last section and then we'll take some questions and some conversation. This last piece is, what do we share and when do we share it, right? And what's important to point out in foster, adoptive, and kinship situations, that our children's stories are not ours to share, right? Those details don't belong to anybody but the child. And we don't really have the right to give that information, and people don't need to know all of that information. So use general information over details, but enough information that gives them what they need to know in order to better interact, more effectively interact with that child. Being proactive whenever possible. And that's not always possible, right? It took us a while to figure out that February was a hard time for my kiddo and why that might be. But whenever possible, being proactive, and be clear on what specific information the staff can share with others. So if there are things that you are sharing with the teacher, be very specific about, this is not information that can be shared with others. We found this great resource, and Renee is going to drop the whole source into the chat for you now, the link to the entire source. But it's this great thing on what should school staff know and what about foster care, and what should they do. So I just picked out some of the highlights here, but you're going to have the link to the entire document. So this might even be something that you share with teachers or you pull from as you're talking with teachers. So they should know, because remember, this is not part of their teacher training. So these are some pieces that can be helpful. That children in foster care are involved with many welfare professionals, right? And so there's going to be lots of kids, lots of adults in that child's life that are working with them. And so wherever we can collaborate and whoever needs to know what, that's important stuff. And school is not always a top priority, right? Survival is for these kiddos. And so they're going to need some grace, and they're going to need relationship building, and they're going to need connection before they need math. And that is okay. And having those conversations with teachers about what those priorities are for you as a family as well. That there might be some gaps in their education depending on what's been happening, right? And then how can we support the child through those gaps? And the trauma is going to be seen in their behavior, right? You're going to see the symptoms of that through their behavior, but that they also have strengths. And this is so important. And then how can we draw on those strengths in the classroom setting? And how can we share what those are so that the teacher can capitalize on those in order to create the best environment, learning environment for the child? And also that there are some unintended negative impacts of discipline on children in foster care, right? There's a lot, some of the stuff that we do with neurotypical children in schools can actually be pretty harmful to the psyche of some of our kids. And so helping them understand too that, we're not dealing with a neurotypical situation, and there might be some different reactions, and there may be some things that we don't intend, but that could be happening. Every time my child came home with his list of transgressions, even though he has a brain-based disability from prenatal exposure and he has trauma, but he started to internalize that he was really a bad kid because of this. And because it was believed that he could help this behavior when in fact he could not. So making sure that teachers understand that piece as well. I clicked on the wrong thing. So sorry. It is, of course, I can't see anything because all my, there we go. My apologies. It's hard when you're sharing screen and stuff is all over the place here. Okay. And then what school staff should know, being flexible with homework and due dates, right? Offer some grace in that, and maintaining that confidentiality and sensitivity is super important. Trauma-informed practices are really powerful. And if they haven't had training, maybe offering them some ideas and places to go. Form Families Forward website would be a great place with some of our webinars. So, and expect that there's going to be trust issues with children in foster care, right? All of our love and all of our good intentions is not necessarily going to mean that the teacher is going to create this great relationship off the bat just because they really like kids, right? It's about the time needed and that investment in that relationship building. And there's going to be some social issues with these kiddos, right? And the key really is building those relationships and establishing that trust. So there are a lot of really cool resources out there where you can create sort of an all about me that you can give the teacher at the start of the year. Now I realize school year has already started, but this is something that you can still do. But you might want to think about doing it each year for the teacher. So it's kind of a profile that gives a really quick visual to the teacher so they can kind of file it away with some information so that they can know a little bit more. It clarifies some important background information that they might need to have. And it clearly states what information can be shared or is not to be shared, right? It includes not just the challenges, but the strengths. And it provides information so there's no room for lack of contact because you will have all your information. So here is one. Renee is going to start dropping some links. We have links to a bunch of different ones, but I'm going to go through this one. This is one that is on our website. And I will show you what an example of a filled out one looks like. So you can see here's Jillian, a picture of her when the teacher will see her, second block math, the things that Jillian is really good at, right? That might be helpful for the teacher in planning activities. She really likes group activities. So this is some place where I know that I can build on one of her strengths. Fractions are super easy. And good at talking out problems, right? So giving me some insight into her learning process. But what are some of the things that are trouble that she has got trouble with? Getting started on work, too many bossy boys, having to write out long answers, right? So that the teacher can begin to see where are those strengths? How can I work with this child? Some things the teacher might need to know. I live with my aunt, and it's okay to share this information. My mom is in jail, but it's not okay to share this information, right? So that the teacher is aware. What works best at school? Sometimes need a break if I can't focus, reading a book if I'm getting overwhelmed. And then here is contact information, how you can get in touch with my caregivers if there is an issue. And then the teacher kind of has this as a quick one pager that they can reference and use when they are creating lessons and the learning environment. There are a whole bunch of others, and Renee's going to stick these in there if she has not already yet, of other student profile formats. Some of these are shorter, some are longer. I will say the two at the bottom there, Understanding Me and Dear Teacher, those are very specific to students with prenatal exposure. I like those and I have used those. They are quite long, but the other really cool thing about them is they also give information about that disability in general, because I found that teachers don't really know what FASD is. And so it's also educates them a little bit about the disability and gives them background, and then shows how that manifests for my child, what that looks like in my child, so that they're also kind of getting some background information without having to read an entire book. So those are some great resources that you can snag and grab. You will get the recording of this, and on that landing page where the recording is, there will also be these slides, so you can go back and access these as well. All right. Look at me, 7 minutes for questions or comments. So does anybody have any questions about anything that we have talked about, or some comments? I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the recording right now so that that part will not be recorded on the